Somewhere in Africa, maybe 800,000 years ago, a small group of early humans is huddled together in the dark. They're cold, they're exhausted, and they're eating raw meat, tearing strips of uncooked flesh off an animal they've just killed with rocks and sheer desperation. They have no idea that their bodies are running at an absolute biological limit. No idea that the brain sitting inside each of their skulls is the most expensive organ in the known animal kingdom, burning through calories like a fire that never goes out. And no idea that one discovery, one accidental encounter with heat-controlled flame, is about to change everything. Not just what they eat, everything. Their bodies, their social lives, the size and wiring of their brains, the shape of their faces, how long they sleep, who they trust, what they talk about in the dark. All of it, transformed by something as simple as holding food over a fire. Here's the question that keeps researchers genuinely awake at night. Why? Why would cooking, of all things, produce changes this dramatic? Animals eat, animals survive, but no other creature on this planet restructured its entire anatomy, its gut, its teeth, its skull, around a method of food preparation. No other species built a social world partly around the act of sharing a cooked meal. No other animal's brain tripled in size in an evolutionary eye blink and then somehow found the fuel to power it. What was it about heat and food that unlocked something this profound? That's what this video is about, and the answer is stranger and more layered than you might expect. The short version is that cooking does something almost miraculous to calories. It breaks down fibers, denatures proteins, gelatinizes starches, and pre-digests food before it even enters the body. More energy out of the same meal, less energy wasted digesting it. For a species teetering on a biological edge, that margin, small as it sounds, may have been the difference between a brain that stayed the same and a brain that grew. But calories are only part of the story, because fire does something else entirely. It creates night. Controlled, safe, social night. And what happened around those early fires, the conversations, the cooperation, the rituals, might have shaped us just as deeply as any nutritional upgrade. Now, to be fair, the timeline here is genuinely messy. The evidence is patchy. Researchers argue about dates and interpretations constantly. We're going to get into all of that honestly, because the uncertainty is part of what makes this story fascinating. The clues are there. They just don't all line up neatly. Before we go further, one quick thing. If you're watching this late at night, maybe winding down, or listening while you drive somewhere, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I actually read them. It's always Tokyo at midnight and Toronto at lunch, all at once. I love that. All right, let's go back to before any of this existed. 2 million years ago, Africa wasn't what it is today. The continent was in the middle of a long, slow, grinding transformation. Forests that had sheltered earlier primates for millions of years were fragmenting, breaking up into islands of trees surrounded by expanding grasslands. The climate was cycling, wet periods followed by brutal droughts, and the animals living through it had two options: adapt or disappear. Some of our ancestors chose, in the only way evolution allows, to come down from the trees, not all at once, not on purpose. But gradually, across generations too long to imagine, certain populations of early hominins found themselves spending more time on the ground, walking upright through those open savannas, eating whatever they could find. And what they found, increasingly, was meat. Not because they were great hunters. Not at first. Early Homo habilis, one of the first members of our genus appearing around 2.3 million years ago, probably wasn't chasing down wildebeest. They were scavengers, opportunists working the margins of bigger predators' kills. A lion makes a kill and walks away. A hyena pack strips it further. And then, skulking in from the edges, early hominins moved in with stone flakes in hand to claim whatever was left. Bone marrow, brain tissue, scraps of muscle clinging to the underside of a rib cage. This is what raw meat eating probably looked like for most of those 2 million years. Not heroic, not cinematic, desperate, strategic, and deeply seasonal. When large carcasses were available, you ate. When they weren't, you ate tubers, seeds, fruits, insects, whatever the landscape offered that week. The diet wasn't a diet in any modern sense. It was a patchwork of opportunities grabbed before something bigger took them from you. Now here's where stone tools become genuinely important, and not just as weapons. The earliest stone tools we found, the Alduin industry, Simple sharp flakes napped off larger rocks date to around 3.3 million years ago. These weren't spears, they were access devices. A sharp stone flake lets you slice through thick hide that your teeth can't penetrate. It lets you crack a femur that no jaw is powerful enough to break. Inside that femur is marrow, dense with fat, rich with calories, and almost completely inaccessible without technology. That marrow was a cheat code in a world where calories were everything. Cut marks on fossil bones tell us this was actually happening. Zooarchaeologists have found animal bones from sites like Tikika in Ethiopia, dating to about 3.4 million years ago, with marks that match stone flake tools. Marks that indicate deliberate butchering. This is behaviour we can actually see preserved in the archaeological record, which is worth pausing on, because a lot of what we think we know about early hominin diet is inferred rather than directly observed. Where patterns on fossil teeth can tell us whether an individual was grinding tough plant matter or processing softer foods. Stable isotope analysis of bone collagen can reveal what broad categories of food someone ate over years of their life. Dental calculus, the hardened plaque on ancient teeth, sometimes preserves fragments of what our ancestors were actually chewing. But none of these signals are perfect, and researchers are genuinely cautious about reading too much into any single piece of evidence. What we can say is that by around 2 million years ago, meat, including raw meat, was a consistent and important part of early Homo diets. The anatomical evidence backs this up. Smaller guts relative to earlier Australopiths, more body mass, and brains that were, slowly but measurably, getting larger. But here's what doesn't get talked about enough. Eating raw meat is expensive in ways that go beyond just finding the animal. The digestion of raw protein and fat is metabolically costly. Your gut has to work hard and for a long time to break down uncooked muscle tissue. Raw starch is almost useless. Raw collagen, the connective tissue binding muscle to bone, passes through largely undigested. There are also parasites. Raw meat, especially scavenged meat that may have sat in the heat for hours, is a vector for pathogens and parasitic worms that a modern immunologist would find alarming. Our ancestors almost certainly had immune systems shaped in part by constant exposure to these threats. But the cost was real. Energy diverted to immune response is energy not going to the brain. Then there's the time problem. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, spend somewhere between 4 and 7 hours a day just chewing. Their diet of tough raw plant matter demands it. Early hominins eating raw meat and unprocessed plant foods were almost certainly doing the same. That's not downtime. That's hours every single day consumed by the mechanics of getting calories in, hours not spent on anything else. And yet, despite all of this, raw meat was clearly working well enough to keep the lineage alive and expanding for an extraordinary length of time. Homo erectus, appearing around 1.9 million years ago, had a brain nearly double the size of earlier Australopiths. Their bodies were essentially modern in proportion. Long legs built for endurance, hands capable of precision gripping. They were good enough at raw food processing that they spread out of Africa into Asia and Europe, colonizing a range of environments across hundreds of thousands of years. So the raw diet wasn't a failure. That's important to hold on to. It funded real evolutionary progress. The combination of scavenging, tool-assisted butchering, marrow extraction, and high-quality animal protein gave early Homo a caloric platform to build on. The brain grew. Social complexity increased. Tool technology slowly improved. But there may have been a ceiling. A hard biological limit that raw food, no matter how cleverly obtained, couldn't push past. The brain that Homo erectus was running was expensive. Some estimates suggest the human brain, even early versions of it, consumed around 20 to 25% of total caloric intake at rest. To keep growing that brain, to keep feeding it, the energy equation had to change. Finding more food wasn't going to be enough forever. Something had to change about how that food was processed. Raw meat helped build us. There's no question about that. But it may have also been the ceiling pressing down on us. A ceiling that required a completely different kind of solution. Not a better tool for getting food. A better tool for transforming it entirely. Here's the thing about brains. They don't come cheap. Right now, sitting still, doing nothing more demanding than listening to this, your brain is consuming roughly 20% of your total resting energy budget. 20%. For an organ that makes up maybe 2% of your body weight. If your body were a city, the brain would be that one neighborhood that burns more electricity than all the others combined, every hour, every night, no matter what. That ratio matters enormously when you're trying to understand what happened to human evolution over the past 2 million years. Because growing a bigger brain isn't just a matter of genetics pointing in a new direction. It's a matter of sustaining something extraordinarily expensive on a diet that had to be hunted, scavenged, dug out of the ground, and eaten raw. Every calorie spent keeping neurons firing is a calorie not going somewhere else, not to reproduction, not to immune defense, not to growing faster or healing injuries. The brain is always first in line, and the rest of the body works around that fact. So the obvious question is, how did early Homo pay for it? Part of the answer may lie in a hypothesis, introduced by biological anthropologists in the 1990s that's still being debated, refined, and argued over today. The expensive tissue hypothesis, proposed by Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler, suggests that the brain didn't grow in isolation. Something else had to shrink to compensate. And the candidate they pointed to was the gut. The logic goes like this. Digestive tissue is itself metabolically expensive. A long, complex gut, the kind you need to break down tough fibrous plant material, costs serious energy to maintain. If early hominins shifted toward higher quality foods, specifically animal protein and fat, foods that pack more calories per gram and require less gut to process, then natural selection might have favored a smaller gut in exchange. Less digestive infrastructure, more energy freed up, and some of that freed energy, potentially, redirected toward the brain. It's an elegant idea, maybe too elegant. Critics have pointed out that the fossil evidence doesn't cleanly support a simple gut for brain swap, and the energetics are harder to calculate than the original model implied. Other factors, including changes in body size, activity levels, and maternal investment, almost certainly played roles. The expensive tissue hypothesis is best understood not as settled science, but as a useful framework, a way of framing the problem that forces us to think about the body as a set of trade-offs rather than a collection of independent systems. Brains don't grow in a vacuum. They grow in bodies with budgets, and those budgets were being stretched by raw food in ways that are easy to underestimate. Consider what raw starch actually does inside the human gut, or more accurately, what it mostly doesn't do. Raw starch granules are locked inside plant cell walls that your digestive enzymes struggle to penetrate. A raw potato isn't just unpleasant, it's genuinely resistant to digestion. Much of the caloric content passes through without being absorbed. Raw meat is somewhat better, because animal protein is more digestible than plant matter even without processing. But raw collagen, the tough connective tissue threading through muscle, is notoriously hard to break down. Raw fat is more accessible, but the overall caloric yield from an uncooked meal is consistently lower than what you'd extract from the same ingredients after processing. Your gut, in other words, has to work harder and deliver less. And gut work burns energy. Hours spent in active digestion, peristalsis churning, enzymes deploying, immune cells monitoring for pathogens in every mouthful of raw scavenged meat. The metabolic cost of digestion on a raw diet isn't trivial. Now layer on top of that the demands of a large brain, not just the energy to run it, but the time required to develop it. Human brains take an extraordinarily long time to reach full capacity. Compared to other primates, human children are dependent for years longer than seems strictly necessary from a survival standpoint. That extended childhood is expensive in a specific way. It requires stable, reliable caloric input over a long period, not just for the child, but for the adults provisioning the child. A mother who has to spend 6 hours a day chewing tough raw food to meet her own caloric needs has less time and energy to feed dependents. A group whose foraging returns are unpredictable and whose gut processing costs are high is always running closer to the margin than a group that has found a way to extract more energy from the same raw ingredients. Better cooperation helped. Social hunting, the kind Homo erectus appears to have been capable of, brings down larger prey than a single individual ever could. Sharing food within the group smooths out the inevitable variation in daily returns. Some days the hunt fails. Some days it succeeds spectacularly, and if you can share the surplus, the group as a whole does better than any individual hunting alone. There's evidence in the archaeological record that food sharing was a real and significant behavior among early Homo populations, and it likely played a genuine role in supporting both larger brains and longer developmental periods. But social hunting and sharing can only push so far. They address the problem of acquiring calories. They don't address the problem of extracting them. A group of early hominins sharing a raw carcass is still absorbing less usable energy from that carcass, than they could if something changed upstream of digestion itself. What if you could begin breaking food down before it ever entered the body? What if, outside the gut entirely, you could start the process of unlocking calories that raw tissue keeps locked away? That's the question that a simple, ancient, terrifying, and endlessly useful chemical process was quietly waiting to answer. Fire isn't subtle. A good blaze throws light, heat, smoke, smell. It blackens rock, splits it, calcines bone until it turns white and crumbly. You'd think if our ancestors had been using fire for 1,000,000 years, the planet would be littered with the evidence. The problem is, fire's traces are fragile, and deep time is ruthless. So when we ask, when did humans start using fire, we're really asking two questions at once. When did some hominin first sit next to flames and think, this is useful? And when did that use become so regular, so woven into daily life, that we can still detect it hundreds of thousands of years later? Archaeologists attack that problem with a pretty specific toolkit. Not stone tools, but evidence types. They look for hearths, shallow basins or patches of soil where ash, charcoal and burnt debris build up in a concentrated spot. Not scattered, not random, but in a tight cluster where people seem to have sat, eaten, worked. They look for ash lenses, thin, pale, powdery layers sandwiched between other sediments. Under a microscope, those layers sometimes reveal burned plant fragments, charcoal particles, tiny glassy bits that form when wood burns hot. If that ash lens sits in the middle of a living floor full of stone tools and butchered bone, that starts to look like a campfire, not a lightning strike. They look for burned bone, bone that's discoloured in recognisable ways, brown and black from charring, chalky white from prolonged high-temperature burning. Sometimes the outside is charred, but the inside is still unburned, suggesting meat shielding the interior during roasting. Sometimes bones are burned in consistent ways, at consistent spots, across an entire site. That begins to smell like cooking. They look for heated stone, flint and other rocks that change colour, crack, or develop telltale internal structures when exposed to specific temperature ranges. Under the right methods, micromorphology, thermoluminescence, you can even estimate how hot the fire got. A rock that was heated to 600 degrees Celsius in the middle of a cave full of stone tools didn't get that way because a tree fell over outside. And crucially, they look at context. Is the burning inside a cave where natural grass fires rarely reach? Is it surrounded by artifacts, knapped stone, cut-marked bones? Are there multiple layers of burning stacked on top of each other, suggesting repeated use over time? Or is it a one-off, a single scorched patch that could just be a piece of luck for a curious hominin sheltering during a wildfire? Those are the kinds of clues we have to work with. They're all partial. They're all vulnerable to being erased by erosion, water, burrowing animals, later occupations, or simply the chemistry of the soil. But taken together, they sketch a rough timeline. If you go back 2 million years into the time of early Homo erectus, the record is mostly silent. There are hints, always hints, sites where animal bones and stone tools show up in layers that also contain ancient ash from natural fires. It's possible those early humans were attracted to burnt landscapes, scavenging freshly killed animals or hardened tubers from still warm ground. They may have been opportunistic fire followers, long before they were fire makers. But clear evidence of controlled fire, that comes later. Some of the earliest candidates show up around 1.5 to 1 million years ago. Places like Kubifora and Chesawanja in Kenya, Swartkrans in South Africa. At Kubifora, there are patches of reddened baked sediment and stones that look like they've been heated beyond what the African sun can do. At Chesawanja, there are clay clasts, lumps of ancient mud, that appear to have been fired to high temperatures. Some researchers see human fingerprints in those traces. Others see the fingerprints of natural grass fires sweeping across the landscape. Wildfires can redden soil, they can bake clay, they can crack rock, they can leave behind charred bone where animals died in the flames. So the debate is always, is this a campfire, or is it just clever geology? Swartkrans adds another layer. There, in deposits roughly 1 million years old, you find hominin bones, animal bones with cut marks, and bone fragments that have been burned. Some of those burns look like they happened after the bone was already dry, which could point to controlled fire in a cave setting. But caves are tricky. They can act like chimneys for natural fires outside. They can be reworked by water and animals. Again, the line between people did this on purpose and nature did this and people were nearby is thin. Fast forward to around 800,000 to 900,000 years ago, and the picture gets clearer at one very famous site, Gesher Benot Yaakov, in what is now northern Israel. Here, on the banks of an ancient lake, archaeologists have found multiple layers, separated in time, each with dense concentrations of burned flint, charred seeds, and plant remains. The burning is localized, not smeared randomly. Some patches are rich in fish bones and nutshells, others in different plant species. It looks very much like repeated, structured use of fire in specific spots, cooking food next to water, coming back again and again over thousands of years. That's not a lightning strike, that's a habit. By about 400,000 years ago, the evidence for habitual fire use becomes almost impossible to ignore, especially in Eurasia. Sites like Qasem Cave in Israel, Beecher's Pit in England, Terra Amata in France, and others across Europe. And the Levant shows central hearth features, thick ash deposits, and clear spatial organisation. In Qasem Cave, for instance, there's a long-lived hearth in the centre of the main chamber, an ash-rich, charcoal-heavy lens that was built up over many thousands of years. Around it, butchered animal bones, including repeated patterns of cut marks and breakage suggesting marrow extraction, stone tools, signs of repeated occupation. The hearth itself seems to have been cleaned and rebuilt over time. That's not just using fire, that's knowing where the fire goes in the house. By this point, we're not arguing about whether humans were using fire, we're arguing about how often, how skillfully, and for what, and that's the key distinction. Occasional fire use versus habitual fire control. Occasional use is being in the right place at the right time. A tree gets hit by lightning, a dry season grassland ignites. An early human edges close enough to warm up, maybe grabs a half-charred bone and eats some cooked marrow, maybe even drags a burning branch into a shelter and huddles beside it until it goes out. That experience alone could change behaviour. It could teach individuals that warm food is softer, that smoke keeps insects away, that predators hesitate at the edge of the light, but then the flames die, and they're back to raw. Habitual control is different. It means not waiting for the weather to hand you fire. It implies a chain of behaviours that have to be learned, shared and maintained. Transporting embers, carrying a smouldering chunk of wood or a bed of coals from one place to another, maybe in a bark container or wrapped in leaves, blowing on it periodically to keep it alive. This turns fire from an event into a resource. Maintaining coals, understanding that a big flashy flame isn't always what you want, that a bed of slow-burning embers is more stable, easier to reignite, better for roasting meat or baking roots. It means adding fuel at the right times, managing airflow, knowing when to rake the coals out and when to bank them. Choosing fuel, learning through trial and error that some woods burn hot and fast, others slow and long, that wet wood smokes more, that dung burns differently from brush, that certain plants used as fuel will flavour food or smoke hides. This is ecological knowledge, encoded in daily practice. Managing risk. Once you're walking around with portable fire, you can also burn down your world. Controlled use implies some understanding, however intuitive, of where not to build your hearth, how not to ignite your shelter, how to keep flames from running upslope into dry brush. Groups that didn't manage that risk probably had fewer descendants. When archaeologists talk about control of fire, they're talking about that whole behavioural package. Not just the ability to sit next to a blaze, but the ability to keep it going, move it, rebuild it, and fold it into social and subsistence routines. Cooking, using fire daily to transform food, sits at the far end of that spectrum. You can imagine an evolutionary progression. At first, fire is rare and frightening. Then it's attractive. Then it's something to be exploited when it appears. Then it's something to be carried and protected. Finally, perhaps, it becomes something you can make from scratch, striking stones, drilling wood, creating flame on demand. Only at that last stage does cooking become fully reliable. Only then can you count on it every evening of your life. We don't know exactly when hominins mastered fire-making itself. Some researchers argue for controlled use, carrying and maintaining natural fire, by around 800,000 years ago, and systematic daily use, including cooking, solidly by 400,000 years ago in many regions. Others would push that timeline earlier, pointing to those ambiguous signals around 1 million years ago and suggesting that even sporadic use could already have been shaping bodies and behavior. Preservation bias is the shadow hanging over all of this. Most early human sites weren't cozy caves protected from erosion. They were open-air camps on floodplains, lake shores, riverbanks, the exact places where water later washed everything away. A small fire on soil leaves a thin ash layer that can disappear in one heavy rain. Charcoal decomposes. Tiny hearths get trampled, eroded, or buried deep enough that we may never find them. Even in caves, later occupations can disturb earlier deposits, smearing the evidence. So absence of hearths doesn't prove absence of fire. It only proves that the kind of evidence we can currently detect isn't there. That's why many anthropologists suspect that the visible record, those clear hearths from 400,000 years ago onward, is just the tip of a much older behavioural iceberg. Fire use may have started opportunistically long before it became archaeologically loud. A few rare experiences of warm, softened food, occasional nights lit by flames instead of starlight, random, uneven, but unforgettable. Even that sporadic use could have begun nudging our ancestors in new directions. Spending more time in caves and rock shelters, gathering fuel, organising camp space around a glowing centre, watching meat change colour and texture as it hung over coals. Before fire became a daily tool, it was a powerful anomaly, and once a species as curious and hungry as ours brushed up against that anomaly often enough, the odds that it would stay rare were never very high. The question isn't just when we tamed fire, it's when fire started taming us. Fire changed our relationship with the landscape. Cooking changed our relationship with food itself. Because once you stop thinking of fire as just warmth and light, and start treating it as a tool for transforming what you eat, you're not just adding hot meals to the menu. You're installing a new operating system in the human body. On the surface, cooking looks simple. You take raw stuff, you expose it to heat, it gets softer and tastier. But under that crackling skin of roasted meat under that steaming tuber, the chemistry looks like a small revolution. Start with protein. Raw animal tissue is basically a bundle of tightly folded protein chains wrapped in tough connective tissue. Those chains are held in specific shapes by delicate bonds, hydrogen bonds, ionic interactions, little weak attractions between side groups. They're like a piece of yarn that's been folded and knotted into a very specific origami shape. When you apply heat, those bonds start to break. The protein denatures, it unfolds. To your teeth and your gut, that's a big deal. Unfolded proteins are easier for digestive enzymes to grab onto and chop into amino acids. The muscle fibers loosen. Connective tissues like collagen, which in a raw state are springy and resistant, begin to melt and turn into gelatin when held at the right temperatures. Take a raw leg of some Ice Age antelope. Eaten fresh off the kill, the surface is chewable, but the deeper muscle and tendons are literal workout bands. A jaw built like a vice can manage it. A jaw built like ours struggles. Roast that same leg slowly over coals, and something else emerges. The tendon that was like rubber becomes silky. The tough fascia between muscle groups converts into a kind of natural jelly. Each bite takes less force, less time. The same quantity of meat suddenly yields more accessible amino acids, with less wear and tear on your teeth, and less work for your stomach and intestines. Now look at plants. Plant cells are boxes inside boxes, starch granules locked inside cells, wrapped in cellulose walls. Our species never evolved enzymes to break down cellulose. To us, it's like chewing plastic wrap. Herbivores get around that with multi-chambered stomachs, specialized gut microbes, long fermentation time. We didn't go that route. Heat gives us a shortcut. Starches are long chains of glucose packed together in semi-crystalline granules. In their raw state, many of those granules are hard, water-resistant, and only partly digestible. When you heat them in the presence of water, boiling, steaming, roasting a water-rich root, the granules swell, absorb water, and burst. This is gelatinization. Gelatinized starch loses its crystalline structure and becomes an open, swollen mesh our enzymes can attack easily. Suddenly, those underground storage organs, tubers, corms, roots, that were once marginal emergency foods become calorie bombs. Same plant, same geology, same climate. But before cooking, that tuber is a mouthful of fiber with some trapped glucose. After cooking, it's a soft, sweet, high-energy package that your gut can strip rapidly. Combine that with the melting of collagen in meat. and you start to see why anthropologists get excited about campfires. Cooking doesn't create calories out of thin air, it reveals them. And that revelation shows up in the energy budget. Every animal walks a tightrope between energy intake and energy cost. Hunting or foraging cost energy. Digestion costs energy. Chewing itself is expensive when you're doing it for hours a day. Raw diets demand that kind of commitment. Modern experiments with people eating only raw plant foods, huge volumes of fruits and vegetables show weight loss, disrupted menstrual cycles, chronic hunger, even with modern access to diverse produce. Raw meat helps, but only if you can tear and process enormous quantities. Heat tilts the equation. Cooked food typically yields more metabolizable energy than the same food raw. Some of that is the denaturation and gelatinization we just talked about. Some of it is mechanical. Softer food is easier to chew into small particles, which give enzymes more surface area to work on. Some of it is that your gut doesn't have to run as hot and long to extract the same payoff. In lab animals, feeding experiments show that those eating cooked versions of the same food gain more weight, or maintain weight better, than those eating it raw, even when the calorie content on paper is identical. The difference is in what the body can actually capture. So imagine an early human group that has learned even partial control of fire. They don't cook everything. They don't cook all the time. But when they do, the consequences add up. The hunters bring back a carcass. Instead of gnawing raw strips and tossing away gristly bits, they can roast joints until the collagen breaks down, then crack the bones over coals and suck out marrow from softened interiors. The gatherers dig up bitter, fibrous tubers and bake them in embers until they're sweet and yielding, not scratchy and half-digestible. In each case, more of the calorie potential in their environment crosses the boundary from technical food to real food. Less effort in, more energy out. That extra energy can go somewhere. It can go into maintaining a big, energy-hungry brain. It can go into supporting longer childhoods, where kids don't have to forage like adults right away. It can go into immune systems, into reproductive capacity, into simply surviving bad seasons with a slightly thicker cushion. But cooking's revolutions aren't just about access. They're also about removal. The natural world is full of chemical booby traps. Plants don't want to be eaten indiscriminately. They defend their tissues with toxins, enzyme inhibitors, bitter compounds that make you regret random sampling. Heat is a crude but often effective antidote. Many plant toxins are proteins or fragile organic molecules that fall apart at cooking temperatures. Others are bound up in structures that cooking disrupts, allowing them to leach into cooking water instead of into your bloodstream. Think of wild legumes containing lectins, or some roots rich in cyanogenic glycosides, or bitter-tasting anti-nutrients that bind minerals. In many cases, boiling, roasting, or baking reduces these to tolerable levels. Not perfect, not universal. Some toxins laugh at heat, but enough that entire categories of previously dangerous or marginal foods become viable staples. Our ancestors didn't know the names of these molecules, but they knew the outcomes. Raw version, stomach cramps, vomiting, maybe death. Roasted version, tolerable bitterness, no obvious poisoning. Those experiments would have been paid for in real time with real bodies, but over generations, culturally transmitted cooking practices would settle on what worked. And then there's the invisible enemy, microbes and parasites. Fresh carcasses and gathered plants come coated in bacteria, fungi, parasites, and the eggs and cysts of things that see your intestines as prime real estate. In warm climates especially, the microbe load is intense. Cooking takes a scythe to that undergrowth. High temperatures kill many pathogens outright. They denature the crucial proteins in bacterial membranes, scramble viral coats, rupture parasitic worms and their larvae. Again, not perfectly. Some spores and cysts hang on through remarkable abuse, but heavily enough that systematically cooked diets carry a much lower burden of infection. Imagine two groups of hominins using the same waterhole and hunting the same animals. One mostly eats raw, the other routinely cooks. Over years and decades, the cooking group sees fewer foodborne illnesses, fewer chronic worm infections, less energy siphoned off to inflamed guts and immune responses. More infants survive weaning, more adults live long enough to pass on whatever social and genetic habits got them near the fire in the first place. Even small statistical advantages like that, compounded over thousands of years, reshape populations. But the strangest, and maybe most overlooked, revolution cooking brings is temporal. It changes the clock. Raw diets don't just demand more chewing power, They demand more chewing time. Studies of chimpanzees and other great apes show them chewing for 4, 6, sometimes 8 hours a day. Every tough, unprocessed mouthful has to be reduced mechanically, because their gut, powerful as it is, can't do everything. Early hominins relying on raw meat and raw plants would have been locked into a similar schedule. Long hours spent stripping flesh from bone, grinding fibrous stems between massive molars, working jaws that looked and functioned more like industrial equipment than like ours. Cooking collapses that timescale. Softened meat and gelatinized starch can be chewed and swallowed quickly. The difference between gnawing a raw strip for 5 minutes and biting through a roasted piece in 20 seconds may not sound like much, but spread it across every bite, every meal, every day, and you free up hours of usable time. Time not spent clamping your jaw shut again and again. Time not spent hunting for just the right textures you can actually process. Time that can be filled with anything else. With grooming and social bonding around a shared hearth. With shaping stone tools in the glow of coals. With telling stories, teaching children, planning hunts, debating where to move when the dry season comes. With just sitting, staring into the flames, letting the mind wander in a way that wild animals rarely can afford. Cooking doesn't just change dinner. It reorganizes the entire day. It allows food processing to be front-loaded. One intense period of work gathering fuel, tending fire, preparing ingredients, followed by a relatively leisurely consumption window. It synchronizes the group. People are more likely to eat at the same time, at the same location, anchored by the hearth. It turns mealtime from a scattered individual scramble into a collective event. That's not just a nutritional tweak. That's a new social platform. Because once a species whose survival has always been dictated by daylight and chewing time suddenly finds itself with predictable evening light, soft food and extra hours of wakefulness after sunset, something unprecedented becomes possible. The day no longer ends when it gets dark. And in that widened slice of night, in the circle of light around a cooking fire, our ancestors were about to discover an entirely new way of being human. If cooking is a new operating system, then evolution started quietly rewriting the hardware to match. You can see it in the skull. Line up a series of hominin heads on a table. Australopithecus, early Homo, something like Homo erectus, and then us. And one trend hits you before anything else. The faces shrink. Those early Australopiths had jaws like power tools, massive flaring cheekbones, huge attachment areas for chewing muscles, molars the size of thumbnails. They look like they were built to spend all day grinding tough plant material, cracking nuts, tearing raw tissue that fights back with every bite. Move forward in time and the jaws slim down. The molars get smaller. The front of the face tucks under the brain case instead of jutting forward. By the time you get to anatomically modern humans, the lower face looks delicate. Orthodontists make a living on how delicate. We routinely don't even have enough jaw real estate for all 32 teeth. You don't evolve away from a heavy-duty chewing machine without something changing upstream. One obvious suspect is cooking. If your diet is dominated by raw, fibrous, mechanically resistant food, natural selection punishes weak jaws and small teeth. Individuals who can't chew enough volume, or whose enamel chips and wears down too fast, simply don't get as many calories. They get sick more often. They die younger. If, over generations, more and more of your calories come in pre-softened, roasted, baked, stewed, even just pre-cut with stone tools, that intense selection pressure eases. Brute chewing strength matters less. Subtle advantages elsewhere can start to matter more. Take Homo erectus, walking around 1.8 million years ago with a brain bigger than its predecessors, legs tuned for long-distance travel, and a face that's already starting to shrink. Richard Wrangham and others have argued that this is the first truly cooked hominin, not necessarily making gourmet meals, but routinely eating food that's been altered by heat. We don't have a fossil of a fire pit with a label saying property of Homo erectus. What we do have are anatomical hints. Compared to earlier hominins, erectus has smaller back teeth, a less projecting face, reduced chewing muscle attachment areas, all while its body size and brain size are going up, not down. Something is letting this species get away with doing more on less jaw. Cooking is one explanation. So is intensive tool processing, slicing meat into thin strips, pounding tubers with stones, grinding seeds. A raw steak that's been sliced thin and tenderized is functionally partway to cooked in terms of chewing effort. A tuber that's been smashed to pulp before eating is easier to process even if it never sees a flame. The fossil record doesn't tell us exactly which behaviour led the trend. It just tells us that the trend is real. Our mouths have been backing away from their original job description for a long time. You can see it in the teeth themselves. Great apes have thick enamel and big molars, built to withstand heavy loads and abrasive plant matter. Early hominins follow that pattern, sometimes exaggerating it. Then, over the last 2 million years, human molars steadily shrink and simplify. The cutting edges of our front teeth are still useful for tearing, but they're not sabers. Our canines are so reduced that fangs is almost a joke. Our entire dental arcade is a compromise, enough to handle a wide variety of foods but not specialised for grinding raw leaves all day, or snapping bone like a hyena, or slicing hide like a big cat. A generalist's mouth attached to a brain that has outsourced more and more of the heavy lifting to technology and culture. But the real smoking gun may be lower down. Open up a chimpanzee, on paper, in anatomy textbooks, and you see a gut that's basically a fermentation factory, a massive colon, an enlarged cecum, a digestive system geared toward extracting every possible calorie from fibrous plant matter. Chimps and gorillas carry microbial ecosystems in their hindguts that turn cellulose and other complex carbohydrates into usable short-chain fatty acids. It's slow, it's bulky, it works. Compare that to us. Relative to our body size, humans have a smaller large intestine, a reduced cecum, a relatively enlarged small intestine. We've shifted emphasis from a big, slow fermentation chamber at the end of the line to a long, efficient absorption tube up front. That makes sense if a large chunk of your diet shows up already pre-processed. By cooking, by pounding, by cutting. Gelatinized starches, denatured proteins, broken down plant cell walls, all of those are perfect for quick uptake in the small intestine. You don't need as much bacterial afterburner when your own enzymes can get to work right away. This rearrangement isn't free. Gut tissue is expensive. Maintaining a giant fermentation vat of microbes requires energy, immune surveillance, constant turnover of gut-lining cells. A big digestive tract is a big metabolic bill. Shrink that bill, and something interesting happens to the budget. You free up energy for other organs. One candidate looms over everything else: the brain. Neural tissue is absurdly costly. In humans, the brain is only about 2% of body weight but burns roughly 20% of resting energy. That's a ridiculous imbalance by mammalian standards. If you're going to support that kind of metabolic diva, you need savings somewhere else. One plausible story goes like this: better food processing, by fire, tools, or both, makes calories easier to get and easier to digest. Over evolutionary time, individuals with slightly smaller guts don't pay as high a penalty because their diets don't require a massive colon to squeeze out every scrap of energy. Those individuals can allocate more resources to growing and maintaining larger brains, or to building bodies capable of long-distance walking and running. As brains and endurance improve, those individuals get even better at finding and processing high-quality food, which further reduces the need for a giant gut. Feedback loop. Better food leads to smaller gut, leads to more spare energy, leads to bigger brain. Better endurance leads to even better access to food. None of this requires cooking to be the only driver. High-quality meat from scavenging or hunting, marrow and brains from cracked bones, rich fat from savanna animals, and coordinated social foraging all matter. So do stone tools that can strip hide, break joints, and pulverize plants. But cooking slots into this loop elegantly. Heat lets you exploit resources that are otherwise marginal: toxic roots, tough seeds, stringy cuts of meat. It raises the average quality of meals and lowers the digestive work required. Over hundreds of thousands of years, that shifts the cost-benefit equation of building and carrying digestive machinery. A species that starts relying on systematically softened, detoxified, microbe-light food doesn't need a gorilla's gut. We didn't keep one. There's another twist: endurance. Humans are, bizarrely, some of the best long-distance runners on the planet. Our legs, tendons, sweating system, and respiratory pattern all look tuned for covering many kilometers at a steady pace under hot sun. Persistence hunting, chasing prey until it overheats and collapses, isn't just a myth. It's been documented in modern foragers and fits our anatomy. Running muscles, sweating skin, and temperature regulation also cost energy. They're part of the same metabolic bargain. A reduced gut plus energy-rich, easily digestible food helps make sustained endurance possible. Endurance, in turn, opens up more hunting strategies and wider foraging ranges, more food options, more selective pressure for brains that can remember landscapes, plan routes, coordinate with others. The loop tightens. Mouth, teeth, gut, brain, legs, and technology aren't separate chapters. They're all threads in one story of shifting energy flows. Of course, not everyone buys the cooking did this version of the story in its strongest form. Some researchers argue that stone tools alone, pre-processing food mechanically, could explain a lot of the anatomical changes, especially early on. Others point to changes in prey species, in habitat, in social organization. Maybe our ancestors were just getting better at securing fatty, nutrient-rich parts of carcasses, or at finding rare but dense plant foods like nuts and seeds. You don't need a campfire to chew carpaccio thin, or to crack bones for marrow, or to pound a root into a paste. And then there's culture. Once you have even basic tools, social learning can spread food processing tricks quickly, without waiting for genes. One smart individual figures out that pounding a tuber makes it less of a jaw workout. Their band copies them. Neighbouring groups copy the band. Suddenly the whole region's chewing load drops, even though nobody's teeth or jaws have changed yet. In that sense, culture may have pulled the first lever. A habit of cutting, pounding, soaking, and eventually heating food could start the process. Anatomy follows. The skulls and guts we carry today are the long, slow record of those experiments. We're a species whose face retreated, whose teeth downsized, whose colon shrank, whose small intestine took centre stage. A species that bet heavily on outside-the-body digestion, on tools, techniques, and fire to take over work that used to be done by enamel and bacteria. That bet came with risks. Dependence on processed food makes you vulnerable when the process breaks down. Lose fire, lose tools, lose social support, and those small jaws and small guts suddenly look like a bad idea. But our ancestors doubled down anyway, because the payoff of that anatomical gamble wasn't just more efficient meals. It was what came bundled with them, the time and energy to sit around those fires we just lit, to share food, and to start building the strange, hypersocial worlds that no other animal has ever seen. And around those shared meals, something else was about to change, not in bone or gut, but in the invisible architecture of nighttime life. Night changes when you can hold a piece of the sun in your hands. Before fire, dark meant danger and downtime. Vision drops, predators rise, temperatures fall. You huddle in whatever shelter you can find, maybe gnaw the last scraps off a bone, then try to sleep through the hours when you're weakest. You don't wander, you don't chat loudly, you certainly don't sit in open ground making yourselves obvious to every hungry set of eyes within earshot. Then someone figures out how to keep a fire going. Suddenly the day doesn't end when the sun hits the horizon. It bends. Picture one of those early camps on an open savanna or under a cliff overhang, a cluster of upright apes with shrinking jaws and expanding brains. The sun slips away, shadows stretch, the air cools. Normally, this is the cue to retreat. Instead, they feed dry branches into a glowing pile of coals. The darkness stops at the edge of a flickering circle. Eyes that would have been useless now pick out faces, hands, expressions. That little island of light becomes a new kind of habitat, and everything about social life starts to tilt. First, it's just practical. Fire keeps you warm when the temperature swings hard between day and night. It dries wet hides, sterilizes water, makes parasites abandon meat. Sparks drive biting insects back. Smoke confuses the smell of prey and predator. But every one of those advantages has a social shadow. If you're huddled tight around a fire to conserve heat, your personal space shrinks. You're forced into each other's orbits. You notice who sits next to whom, who reaches for the best spots, who shares their cooked piece with a child, who doesn't. Faces, which in daytime can be lost in the chaos of foraging and walking and hunting, are now floating masks in the dark, all turned toward the same center. Fire gives a group a focal point. Most animals share space by day and scatter by night. For humans, the pattern starts to invert. A band that spends daylight hours splitting up, some tracking games, some gathering tubers, some checking trap lines, reconverges when the light fades. The campfire is the rendezvous coordinate baked into the landscape. That daily rhythm changes what a group even is. Instead of just a set of individuals using the same territory, you get a population that comes together repeatedly to process the day. to redistribute food, to reassure each other that, yes, those distant roars stayed distant, to notice who limped back, who didn't come back at all. Around those flames, bonding stops being a side effect and becomes an activity. You can groom each other in low light, but fingers fumbling through hair only go so far. Fire takes social maintenance to a different level. You can see whole bodies, gestures, subtle shifts in posture. You can maintain eye contact, which primates use for everything from threat to affection to teaching. You can detect micro-expressions that signal fear, shame, amusement, irritation. Conflict, in that context, isn't just a flash of violence and avoidance. It can be negotiated. Two hunters who nearly came to blows over a carcass that afternoon are now sitting shoulder to shoulder, listening to the same elder recap how they almost got everyone killed by charging a wounded animal. Jokes get made at their expense. Tension diffuses through shared laughter. Or, if it doesn't, the whole group sees the problem forming in slow motion and can intervene. Fire doesn't magically make us peaceful. It gives us time and light to manage the mess. It also gives us time to plan. Daylight hours are hard to waste when you're a forager on a tight energy budget. You're walking, scanning, digging, cutting. Your attention is pulled outward by tasks that can't wait. Evenings around the fire open a different mental space. Somebody can reenact how the antelope herd reacted when they approached from the downwind versus upwind side. They can stab the ground with a stick to mark out hills and gullies. Others can chime in with memories from last season, where the waterholes lasted longest, where the lions denned. This is rudimentary cartography done with gestures and gravel. Once the band has a shared picture of the landscape, they can do something almost no other animal can do. Pre-play, tomorrow. Tomorrow we split into two groups. You circle wide. We wait here until the sun reaches that tree. If you see vultures over there, don't go. They're over the hyena's kill. None of that needs modern grammar. Pointing, sounds, mimed actions, maybe a few proto-words are enough. But whatever language toolkit they have, the firelight makes it available at a new scale. There's time to rehearse, time to correct misunderstandings before they become fatal mistakes. Time to let children sit quietly on the edge of the circle, absorbing spatial knowledge and hunting logic long before they're strong enough to throw a spear. This is where the idea of a second daytime starts to become real. Biologically, humans are still diurnal. Our eyes aren't built like owls. Our hearing isn't sonar. But culturally, we're starting to live as if we have 2 days. One under the sun for physical work, one under the flames for mental work. The second day is when memory gets shared. It's where teaching really finds its home. You can show someone how to nap a stone in bright daylight. You probably do. But instruction needs repetition. It needs context. It needs stories about what happens if you do it wrong. Firelight evenings are perfect for that. Old hands can hold up tools, compare edges, critique craftsmanship. They can demonstrate how a slightly different angle on the flake makes a much sharper scraper. They can tell the tale of the time someone took a poorly made spear on a hunt and how that ended. That's not just do this, don't do that. It's narrative. Once you start embedding technical lessons inside little arcs of cause and effect, with characters, with near misses, with punchlines, you've stepped onto the path toward myth. We don't know when fully developed storytelling appears. There's no fossil for plot. But we do know that longer, safer, shared evenings create the ecological niche for it. If a story can hold a group's attention, it can carry more than just entertainment. It can encode whose territory lies beyond the third river, which plants are food if boiled, poison if raw, which neighbouring band cheated in a trade 3 years ago, who among your grandparents first brought fire from that lightning-struck tree on the ridge. Turn any of that into a memorable narrative, and it's more likely to stick in a child's head, more likely to be repeated, more likely to survive beyond the lifespan of any individual witness. That's cultural transmission running on narrative rails, and cooking itself becomes part of the curriculum. Recipes probably don't start out as 3 handfuls of this, 2 pinches of that. They're more like patterned actions. This tuber must be buried in coals until the skin blackens and cracks. This meat must be turned so the fat doesn't drip and flare. These seeds must be parched on flat stones, not directly in the flame. Children learn to associate specific smells, colours and textures with safe versus dangerous. Adults narrate, "Don't eat it while it's hard, it will make you sick. Wait until it's soft and sweet." Cooking methods, passed down and refined, start to look like inherited traits, except they move through conversation and imitation instead of DNA. Fire also changes how safe you feel about holding ground. There's decent evidence that large predators dislike flames. Modern lions, hyenas and leopards tend to hesitate near bright, hot, unpredictable light. Early humans crouched in the glow of a campfire would have looked less like prey and more like a strange hazardous phenomenon. Even if the actual deterrent effect was patchy, some nights it works, some nights it doesn't, the psychological effect on our ancestors would have been enormous. Camping with fire feels different than sheltering in the dark. You can push your sleeping area out into more open terrain instead of always clinging to cliffs and dense thickets. You can afford to carry more stuff, stones, bones, heavy logs, because you're returning to the same hearth night after night. You can enforce a sense of "this is our place" that extends beyond daylight presence. Territory stops being just where you forage and starts being where your fires have burned. That confidence underwrites bolder behavior. You might stay up a bit later, finishing a hide, retelling a hunt, teaching knot tying. You might dare to raise your voice in laughter, knowing that whatever is listening out there doesn't like walking through flames to get you. Protection and perception feed back on each other. A group that believes itself protected is more willing to invest in long-term projects, building better hearths, caching food, elaborating rituals. Those in turn deepen the psychological link between our people and our fire. At some point, the flames at the center of the camp stop being mere tools and become symbols. They stand for continuity, for usness. The morning fire is lit from last night's coals. The coals came from a log someone dragged from a burn-scarred grove weeks ago. That grove was discovered by a hunter whose story is told every time the embers flare up. Hearths become anchors in time. They tie the living to the recently dead. Your grandfather used to sit there, to the distant past. Before we came to this valley, we had a fire there. To imagined futures, when you are old, you will show your grandchildren how to keep the coals alive through the rain. In that glow, language has room to grow teeth and wings. It's no longer just for immediate coordination. Throw, run, look out. It starts to handle hypotheticals, counterfactuals, jokes, lies, promises. The more the group leans on evening talk to glue itself together, the more natural selection turns up the volume on brains that can handle complex syntax, nuanced tone, long-term memory for verbal material. Songs that help synchronize movements around the fire or during group tasks get stuck in heads. Ritualized chants at the start of a hunt build cohesion. Lullabies soothe anxious children staring at the ghostly shapes beyond the light. Under these conditions, the individuals who are better at speaking and listening, who can track who said what to whom, who can recycle a good story with just the right twist, earn status. Status leads to mating opportunities. Their language-friendly genes and habits spread. Firelight becomes a fitness landscape. Across thousands of evenings and many generations, that second daytime, the one framed by darkness and flame, turns into a kind of cultural accelerator. Tools improve not just through trial and error, but through critique and instruction. Social rules are discussed, not just enforced with blows. Group reputations travel along trade routes via tales told at borrowed hearths, and somewhere along the way, our ancestors stop being just clever apes who eat cooked food and become something stranger. Animals whose most important adaptations live not in bone or muscle, but in shared stories told after dark. Cooking gave us extra calories and softer meals. Firelight gave us extra hours and a stage. On that stage, a new social world took shape, one where knowledge could accumulate, where identities could be negotiated, where memories could outlive bodies. The next step was almost inevitable. Once you have a species that gathers nightly around a shared resource, with talk and planning and expectations, you've set the table for something else to evolve on top of the flames. Rules. Who cooks, who eats, who serves, who waits. The economics of sharing are about to get complicated. Start with that last line. Who cooks, who eats, who serves, who waits. Once you have heat that transforms food, those aren't background details anymore. They're politics. Fire doesn't just warm bodies and light faces. It rearranges space. A raw meat world is mobile. You chew where you kill, or you duck into whatever shade or crevice is handy. Bones pile up everywhere. There is no obvious center, just a shifting cloud of activity that follows carcasses and fruiting trees. A cooking world is different. Cooking likes stillness. It needs a place where you can stack fuel, keep embers alive, prop meat on sticks or stones without ash and dirt constantly blowing through. Somewhere that's worth returning to because the labour of building it up pays off over time. Archaeologists call these central places, hearth clusters, ash lenses, burnt bone piles that show up in the same spots layer after layer. For early humans, a hearth is more than a useful patch of ground. It's a gravitational well. People orbit it. You bring raw food in. You bring tools in. Stones, knives, pounding rocks, wooden spits. You leave behind broken bits, sharpened flakes, half-burned logs. Over weeks and months, a messy but recognizable pattern forms. This is where things happen. Once you've got a place like that, you also have a problem. Other people can see what you have. Raw food is easy to eat on the sly. Tear off a chunk, duck behind a bush, swallow fast. But a pot simmering over coals, a slab of meat slow roasting on a frame of branches, those are announcements. Smell travels, smoke travels, waiting bodies gather, and cooked food is divisible. You can cut it, scoop it, ladle it. You can decide who gets the crispy bits and who gets the boiled gristle. The moment those decisions matter to anyone's survival or status, you've created an arena for negotiation. You can imagine the first awkward scenes. Someone drags back a haunch or a sack of tubers. Instead of ripping and gnawing on the edge of camp, they hand it to whoever's tending the fire. The cook controls the pace now. Nothing happens until the coals are right, the sticks arranged, the skins peeled. Other foragers drift in. Eyes watch closely. How much is there? How big are the pieces? Who's whispering to whom? When the food is finally ready, it doesn't vanish in a flurry of teeth. It passes from hand to hand. Slowly enough that everyone can see the pattern. Who gets served first? Infants, nursing mothers, successful hunters, elders, the person who kept the fire alive all day. Who is conspicuously skipped? Over hundreds of evenings, those patterns harden into expectations. This is where the first rules start to live. Not as written laws, obviously, but as shared feelings about what's normal and what's outrageous. If you routinely grab the lion's share for yourself, if you sneak extra portions to your cousins while others watch their kids go to sleep hungry, people remember. Reputation is born in firelight. Humans are already talented at keeping mental scorecards. Primates track favors and slights all the time. But the hearth concentrates the evidence. It makes stinginess and generosity, fairness and cheating visible to everyone at once. Some anthropologists call hunter-gatherer bands leveling societies. People don't let anyone get too far above the rest. Boasting hunters get teased. Bullies get ganged up on. Someone who hoards can find themselves mocked, ostracized, or quietly cut out of future help. The cooked meal is a perfect stage for that kind of enforcement. A hunter who refuses to share might find that next time he needs help carrying a carcass, no one volunteers. A chronic slacker might get the thinnest scraps handed last. Someone who shares widely, who makes sure orphans and elders are fed even when times are lean, becomes the person others want to camp near, support, and imitate. These are not abstract moral codes. They're finely tuned survival strategies. In small, risky environments, you don't want your future to depend entirely on your own luck. You want a safety net woven out of many people's goodwill. Cooking makes that net thicker. Because cooked food often comes in batches, big pots, large roasts, there are more situations where one person or family has too much for one sitting. The easiest way to turn surplus into insurance is to share it, and to do so in ways that others recognize as fair. Fair, of course, can mean different things. Maybe the rule in one band is, from each according to what they brought back. Big bringers get big pieces. In another it might lean toward, to each according to their need, with sick and small bodies favoured over strong young adults. Most likely systems mixed both, contribution plus vulnerability. Whatever the details, they had to be defended. Someone grumbles, someone tries to double dip, arguments break out. In that moment, hands hovering over a shared pot, voices rising, you're looking at something new in the animal world, a social institution. The hearth isn't just a pile of coals, it's a place where predictable procedures happen, a place where the group can say, explicitly or implicitly, this is how we do things here. Don't like it? There are always other fires. but each fire comes with its own terms. Once that becomes true, division of labour stops being hypothetical. Cooking itself is labour. Gathering fuel, keeping coals alive through rain and wind, knowing which plants must be leached or roasted to strip out toxins. These are skills with their own prestige. Who does that work? In some modern hunter-gatherer groups, women are the main fire tenders and plant cookers, while men focus on big game hunting. In others, tasks are more flexible, with older children tending fires or men doing much of the cooking when women are nursing infants. We have no reason to think there was a single original system. What cooking does is open the possibility space. You can have specialist firekeepers whose main contribution is reliability rather than physical strength. You can have expert tuber processors who know exactly how long to roast the bitter roots so they won't paralyze anyone. You can have people who rarely leave camp at all, those with injuries, frail elders, who still matter because they supervise, teach or mediate disputes at the hearth. As tasks diversify, so do social roles. A band where everyone does everything badly is fragile. A band where skills are distributed and interdependent is more resilient, but also more entangled. If the firekeeper gets angry and walks off, hunts fail even if the hunters are strong. If the best tracker's child is mistreated at the hearth, they may withhold their abilities. Cooking ties fates together. It also changes the calculus for caring for the non-productive members of the group. Raw diets are hard on teeth, guts, and joints. You need strong jaws to chew tough roots, good mobility to travel far for scattered food. In a raw world, anyone who can't keep up faces a brutal arithmetic. Cooked food is softer, more energy-dense, easier to eat with worn teeth or limited bite strength. Hot broths and mashed tubers can be swallowed by the toothless and the very young. Now, a grandmother with bad knees can still eat well, and because she survives, she can tell stories, correct mistakes, remember where the waterholes persisted in the last drought. Evolutionary biologists talk about the grandmother hypothesis, the idea that human lifespans beyond reproductive years are favoured because elders boost the survival of grandchildren. Cooking and a central hearth are exactly the kind of conditions that make that possible. The same applies to the injured. A hunter speared in the thigh is a liability if everyone is constantly on the move, gnawing raw meat in transit. In a camp with a fire, he can lie near the warmth, eat soft food, and slowly heal while others bring cooked portions to him. That doesn't mean early bands were hospitals full of convalescents. Mortality was still high. But you don't need perfect care, just slightly better odds that a broken bone can knit, that an infection can be outlived. Those slightly better odds add up over thousands of generations. Kids, too, benefit. Cooked food can be weaned earlier, in smaller, safer bites. Children can share in adult meals rather than relying solely on milk or easy-to-chew scraps. Around the fire, they also watch the adult sharing economy in action. Who serves first? How disputes are settled? What jokes are acceptable? What greed looks like when everyone turns and stares? They absorb the unwritten constitution of their group one mouthful at a time. By now, the hearth is doing several jobs at once. It's a stove, a court, a daycare, a memory bank, a job site. When you step back and look at it from an evolutionary distance, it starts to resemble something very familiar from later human history. An institution. Institutions are stable arrangements that outlast individuals. Grandmother sits there. Food is passed this way. Guests get a portion even if they arrived late. These become so routine that violating them feels like an attack on the group itself, not just on a person. That feeling is powerful. It's what lets a set of fragile primate brains behave as if they belong to something bigger and more enduring than any one of them. The band, the camp, the lineage. The hearth is the first place that bigger thing takes shape. We can't dig up laws from 400,000 years ago. We can't exhume a fossilized argument over who got the last marrow bone. But we can see the blackened circles of ancient fires, clustered in patterns that say, unmistakably, people kept coming back here. They kept enacting the same dances of exchange, obligation, and judgment. They kept teaching children that this is how we do it. From there, it's a short cognitive step to extend those rules outward. If there are right ways to share food within the camp, there might be right ways to share hunting territories between camps. If you owe meat to the grandmother who watched your kids, maybe you owe shells or hides to the neighbouring band that shared fire when yours went out. The sharing economy that begins with cooked meals doesn't stay put. It spills into trade, marriage, alliance, and eventually conflict. Because once you have institutions, you can have institutional rivalries, different hearths, different rules, different bans, different expectations. Fire had solved the calorie bottleneck and gifted us extra hours in the day. Now, by pulling us into its circle night after night and forcing us to decide who gets what, it was doing something subtler, training us to live inside invisible structures of obligation and fairness. The next consequence would be geographic. If you can cooperate reliably around shared meals, you can tackle bigger, riskier projects, like expanding into places no primate has any business surviving at all. If cooperation around the hearth lets you tackle bigger projects, the first and most obvious project is simple: stop starving. Raw food hominins were already tough. They could crack bones, gnaw cartilage, clamp their jaws onto leathery hide. But the menu was still narrow in an important way. It wasn't about how many kinds of things were technically edible. It was about how many kinds of things were edible often enough and safely enough to count on. Walk through a raw landscape and you'll see it everywhere. Almost food. Roots that are too fibrous to chew with worn teeth. Tubers so packed with toxins that your tongue burns when you nick them. Seeds locked inside husks your molars can't crush. Meat that's gone just a little too long in the sun, crawling with parasites your gut isn't ready for. Cooking turns a lot of that almost food into real food. Heat does several jobs at once. It softens fibers so plant cell walls that used to fight your teeth now give way and spill out their starch. It denatures proteins, unwinding them into structures your enzymes can grab more easily. It breaks down some toxins outright and makes others leachable, bitter compounds that can be boiled away or roasted into harmlessness. Suddenly the underground pantry of the world opens, those knobbly, bitter tubers that no one bothered with. Roasted long enough, they become sweet, chewable, and safe. Starchy corms, rhizomes, and roots that would shred a raw chewer's gums turn into something a child or an elder can mash with the flat of a wooden stick. Same with meat. Raw, it's a gamble. Fresh, you get a flood of nutrients. Slightly off, you might just get an upset stomach. A bit more off, and you get parasites, diarrhea, or outright poisoning. In a raw world, the safe window is narrow. You kill, you eat fast, you move on. Fire stretches that window. Roasting kills many parasites. Long, slow heat dries the outer layers, creating a crude form of preservation. Smoked strips can last for days. In cold conditions, where the air is dry and freezing, cooked meat plus natural refrigeration can last even longer. What used to be an emergency glut, we killed something big, now we have to gorge before it rots, becomes a resource you can spread over time. This is seasonal buffering. Imagine a year not as one stretch of enough food, but as a sawtooth. Feast, lean, feast, famine. Raw foragers ride that sawtooth with very little cushion. If the rains fail, if a migration route shifts, if fruiting is late, there's not much to fall back on except the very hardest to eat foods, and many of those are still off limits. Cooking changes the geometry of scarcity. In the wet, generous seasons, you're not just full. You're stocking up on things that keep: smoked meat, dried roots, roasted nuts. In the lean, cold, or dry seasons, you're not reduced to digging up stringy roots and choking them down raw. You can roast them until the fibers loosen and some of the toxins degrade. Even marginal environments, places where most foods are tough, woody, or chemically defended, start to look less like death sentences and more like puzzles. If you know the right sequence, peel, slice, soak, boil, roast, you can eat things that would hospitalize a chimpanzee. Anthropologists call this expanding the dietary niche. A less technical way to put it is, cooking widens the edible world. Animals are usually exquisitely tied to particular food types. Pandas and bamboo, koalas and eucalyptus. Even versatile predators have preferred prey ranges and digestive sweet spots. Fire breaks that tight coupling. Your ancestors stopped being just meat plus a few fruits specialists and moved toward whatever this landscape offers after sufficient application of heat and ingenuity. That has obvious implications for where you can live. Once you can cook, good habitat is no longer limited to places with soft fruits, tender greens, and predictable carcasses. It can include dry savannas where most food is locked underground in tough tubers, cold steppe where the main calories are in sinewy muscle and frozen fat, coastal zones where shellfish need to be steamed open and seaweeds boiled to reduce their harshness, wet forests with toxic seeds that become edible only when roasted just right. Of course, fire doesn't do this alone. Clothing matters. You can't just wander into a Pleistocene winter naked and hope that a hot potato will keep you alive. Shelters, caves, windbreaks, lean-tos matter too. So do better tools, spears, scrapers, digging sticks hardened in the coals. What cooking does is make those other investments worthwhile. You can skin an animal with a stone flake. You can sew a crude hide cloak with a bone needle. But if your food supply still vanishes every time the season turns, those clothes and huts only postpone starvation. A broader, more reliable menu is the foundation that makes expansion sustainable. You see this especially in cooler regions. Cold doesn't just threaten you with hypothermia, it shrinks your foraging radius. Plants die back, insects vanish, small animals hibernate. The remaining resources, big game, underground storage organs, preserved nuts, are exactly the ones that benefit most from cooking. A carcass in freezing air is a battery of calories waiting to be unlocked. Cooked fat is easier to digest, yields more usable energy, and provides warmth from the inside out. Slow-boiled bone broth pulls collagen, minerals, and marrow into a liquid even a worn-out jaw can handle. And there's another layer. Better nutrition doesn't just keep you from dying, it gives you spare capacity. Well-fed bodies can do more work. They can walk farther in a day. They can carry heavier loads. Infants, tools, stored food, firewood. They can recover faster from injuries and infections. They can sustain longer periods of cold exposure because their metabolisms have more fuel to burn. This is where cooking quietly ties into one of our other great oddities, endurance. Humans are not especially fast sprinters, but we are astonishingly good at low-speed, long-distance travel. Persistence hunting, chasing animals not by outrunning them in a sprint but by tracking and dogging them until they overheat, only works if your own body can keep burning energy steadily for hours. Cooked food makes that physiology more feasible. It makes calories cheaper to extract. It reduces the wear and tear on teeth and guts. It supports bigger glucose-hungry brains that can run complex tracking strategies, remember landscapes, and coordinate with other hunters over many miles. So every time a band decides to move, over the next ridge, across a valley, along a new river, they're drawing on an invisible bank account of cooked calories. Fire doesn't carry you, but it pays for your legs. Now scale that up from daily foraging to generational migration. Each small shift in camp location, each seasonal round that pushes a little farther into new territory, is cushioned by the fact that you're not betting everything on one narrow food source. If the berries fail here, maybe the roots still work. If the usual herd route is empty, maybe the shellfish beds can carry you this year. Cooking is what turns those maybes into realistic fallback plans. This flexibility is why when climates wobble, glacials advance, monsoons shift course, forests thin into grassland, cooking populations have options. In a bad decade, raw specialists either track their one preferred food or die. Cooked generalists can retool. They can experiment with new plants, new parts of animals, new preparation chains. Many attempts will fail. Someone gets sick, someone remembers, never eat that again, but some will stick. Knowledge accumulates. The library now includes not just where to find food, but how to make questionable stuff safe. Whole environments that used to be classified as barely usable get recoded as tricky, but doable if you know the tricks. The last piece of the puzzle is psychological. Once you have a reliable hearth, a memory of what roasting did to that terrible root last year, and a mental map of where fuel can be found, home becomes less tied to any one specific patch of ground. Home is no longer this cave, this grove, this bend in the river. Home is wherever we can make a circle of heat, find something to throw in the pot and keep the embers alive. That's a profound shift. It means that when conflicts arise over mates, hunting rights, water holes, you're not condemned to fight to the death over a single location. You can leave, take your skills, your stories, your recipes for detoxifying roots, and try your luck somewhere new. Bands fission, a quarrel around the hearth, a quiet decision at dawn, a group walking away with their own bundle of fire. Bands fuse, two groups meet, trade not just meat and tools but knowledge of plants, cooking times, safer ways to prepare that weird shellfish. Over hundreds of thousands of years, that constant splitting and rejoining, that sharing of techniques for turning hostile landscapes into temporary kitchens, etches pathways across continents. Fuel availability matters, of course. You can't cook without something to burn. But humans prove remarkably inventive here too. Dried dung on treeless plains, driftwood on coasts, peat and roots where forests are sparse. As long as there is some combustible material and something vaguely edible, the cooking mind sees not just hardship but possibility. This is what sets the stage for the truly audacious moves later in our story. Crossing glacial Europe, climbing onto high plateaus, eventually braving ice edges and open water. Before you can imagine new maps, you have to imagine new menus. Fire gave our ancestors both. It turned deserts and steppes and wind-scoured coasts from places you might pass through into places you might stay, at least for a while. It unhooked livable from comfortable and anchored it instead to a different condition. Is there fuel, and is there anything we can coax into digestibility with enough time over the coals? Once the answer to that question was often enough yes, the world stopped being a patchwork of isolated refugees. It became continuous. The spaces between the good spots shrank, stitched together by bands willing to walk, experiment, and build new homes around new fires. And all the while, something else was happening in the background. Those better-fed brains, warmed by hearths and challenged by dangerous frontiers, were quietly changing. Not just in what they could eat or where they could walk, but in how they could think. A brain is not a decoration. It's a furnace. Pound for pound, nervous tissue is some of the most expensive stuff a body can run. Human brains are about 2% of our mass and can burn something like 20% of our resting calories. That's in a modern, well-fed person. For a hungry hominin on a marginal savanna, every extra gram of brain is a gamble. You don't just grow a big brain, you have to pay for it. Cooking doesn't magically rewrite DNA. It doesn't snap its fingers and produce Einstein. What it does, slowly and quietly, is change the budget sheet. Before fire, a hungry body faces hard trade-offs. Spend calories on walking farther today, or on maturing slowly and growing a slightly bigger brain. Divert resources to a fetus and a nursing infant, or keep your own immune system from collapsing during a bad dry season. In that world, long childhoods and energy-hungry brains are luxuries you can't always afford. Cooked food nudges the math. When roots are softer, meat is safer, and leftovers stretch through the lean weeks, you're not just avoiding starvation. You're smoothing out the spikes of feast and famine. Instead of your development being hammered by repeated crashes, this year you grew, next year you shrank, the year after that you nearly died. You get more years of good enough. Brains love good enough. They don't need perfect. They need not starving, not infected, not fleeing for your life every hour. They need enough steady energy that neurons can wire up, prune, and rewire again without the whole organism collapsing from malnutrition. That's one of the quiet revolutions fire makes possible. More stable development. In biology, we call it plasticity. Neuroplasticity is just the brain's ability to change its own wiring, strengthen some connections, weaken others, build new circuits in response to experience. Babies and children are especially plastic. They're basically walking learning engines covered in skin. But plasticity has a cost. It's expensive to keep all those options open, to maintain a brain that can still be sculpted by new skills, new languages, new social rules. If you're constantly on the edge of starvation, there's pressure to shut that down early. Mature fast, reproduce fast, don't waste time and energy on prolonged childhoods. Now imagine the same genes, the same basic brain-building toolkit, but in a world with more reliable cooked calories and safer nights around the fire. Infants actually make it through the first fragile years. Toddlers aren't burning half their day just trying to chew. Children can sleep more deeply because predators are held at bay by flame, and adults taking shifts by the embers. That extra security doesn't cause bigger brains in a simple, one-step way. But it removes some of the constraints that kept brain growth and learning time in check. Under those conditions, natural selection can favor individuals who stay plastic longer. Kids who keep learning well into adolescence. Adolescents whose brains are still flexible enough to pick up complex hunting strategies, plant lore, social norms. Adults whose neural circuits can still adapt to new environments, new alliances, new enemies. And once you start lengthening the window of learning, a new set of cognitive tricks becomes thinkable. Planning, for one. Raw-world foragers plan too, of course. Lots of animals do. A squirrel burying nuts is making a plan. But planning in a cooked world can become layered and abstract. You're not just thinking, I'll eat this later. You're thinking, if we smoke this much meat now, we can afford to move camp next week and still have reserves for the journey. You're coordinating firewood gathering with hunting schedules, keeping mental tallies of who contributed what, deciding whether to risk crossing a river now or after you've built up more stores. Those are not reflexive, in-the-moment choices. They're decisions stretched across time, delayed gratification. We don't eat it all now because we'll need it then, is only realistic when then exists as more than a blur of constant emergency. Cooking, storage, and a wider menu carve out that future in your mind. It's one thing to have the capacity for self-control. It's another to have a daily environment that makes self-control actually useful. Firelit life does that. A similar shift happens in social reasoning. Once meals become shared projects instead of private scrambles, brains have to track more variables. Who brought the meat? Who tends the fire most nights? Who gives food to whose children? Who remembers how to cook that dangerous tuber without killing anyone? Every one of those questions points to a network of favors, debts, reputations, and obligations. And those networks get denser as the group's survival depends more on collective control of flame and food. A poorly managed hearth is a risk to everyone. Someone falls asleep without banking the coals, and the camp loses its fire. Someone habitually eats more than their share and trust erodes. Someone lies about knowing how to detoxify a plant, and suddenly half the band is sick. In that world, being able to model other minds, guess what they know, what they want, what they might do tomorrow, pays off in a big way. Psychologists call this theory of mind. Out on the savannah, it's just survival. Cooking doesn't invent social cognition from scratch, but it brings new complexity to the table. The moment your survival depends on coordinated action, firewood gathering, guarding embers, staggering hunting trips, caring for the young while others cook, your brain has more incentive to get good at reading others, negotiating, keeping track of reputations over months and years. And once again, plasticity plus time do the rest. Children growing up around a hearth aren't just learning recipes and foraging routes. They're soaking up stories about why we don't trust that cousin, and how that band over the hill cheated us last season, and what happened the one time someone tried to hoard dried meat. Those stories are lessons in social causality. If you do X, people respond with Y, and they're being inscribed on a brain that still has room to remodel. Now zoom out from the individual to the group. Imagine two bands. Both have access to fire in a basic sense. Both can char meat, roast tubers, keep predators at bay. But in one band, the social and cognitive machinery for managing fire is clumsy. People let flames go out. They fight constantly over portions. No one really specializes. Knowledge about which plants are safe is scattered and often lost when an elder dies. In the other band, something different is happening. They've evolved calmer temperaments, more impulse control, tighter caregiving. They've stumbled into more effective teaching. Older children showing younger ones where to find fuel. Adults deliberately explaining rather than just demonstrating. They have norms about who eats first, who watches the fire, how to share when times are lean. Those norms are fragile, but they give that group a tiny edge. They waste less food to accidents. They lose fewer fires. More infants survive. More knowledge passes cleanly from one generation to the next. Over hundreds of lifetimes, that small edge can mean the difference between expanding into a new valley or collapsing back into marginal refuges. That's feedback. Better cognitive tools help you manage fire more reliably. Better fire management feeds your children more consistently. Better fed children can afford longer brain growth and learning, which opens room for more sophisticated norms and teaching, which feed back again into even better fire management. Generations later, you end up with brains and cultures adapted to a cooked world. Not because fire caused intelligence in a single step, but because fire and intelligence kept ratcheting each other upward. It's tempting to tell this as a simple story. First we tamed fire, then our brains got big, then language and art followed like dominoes. Reality is messier. Brain evolution is multi-causal. Climate swings, predator pressures, disease burdens, mating systems, tool use, and sheer chance all tug on the direction of change. Cooking is one strong candidate in a crowded field, not the sole hero of the plot. You can even flip the arrow and argue the other way. Maybe our ancestors were already slightly smarter, better at tool use, more cooperative, so they were the only apes who could reliably control fire in the first place. In that view, cognition enables cooking, which then reshapes cognition further. Cause and effect blur into a loop. Either way, the most profound rewiring might not be inside a single skull at all. It might be in the way many skulls link together. A lone genius with a clever brain and no one to talk to can only do so much. A small band with fire, shared meals, and long evenings has something new. Time and space to think together. Around a hearth, ideas can hop from mind to mind. Someone tries a new way of stacking wood. Someone else notices it burns longer. A third person tells the story to cousins in another camp months later. A child hears the tale and years after tweaks the technique again. No one brain holds the entire innovation. The group does. This is cultural cognition, the ability to store information outside of any one person in habits, stories, rituals, and tools. Cooking accelerates it because it gives you a daily rhythmic reason to gather, talk, watch, imitate, and remember. In a sense, the real big brain that emerges in a cooking species is not just the organ in your skull. It's the campfire conversation. It's the shared memory of which roots to roast, which embers travel best, which neighbouring band can be trusted to trade hearth secrets. It's the collective model of the world that no single child could reconstruct alone, but that any child can inherit if they sit close enough to the flames and listen. The calories unlocked by cooking help pay for bigger, more plastic brains. Those brains, in turn, make it possible to weave individual minds into something larger, a network of shared knowledge and long-term plans that stretches across lifetimes. Once that kind of distributed thinking exists, the trajectory of our lineage bends, not just towards survival, but towards something stranger: art, myth, religion, science. All the wild, abstract things that would eventually be dreamed up by descendants of those first firekeepers, staring into the coals and wondering what else might be possible. Everything we've talked about so far lives in this hazy space between biology and possibility. The feedback loop between fire, food, brains, and culture makes sense. It fits what we know about metabolism and development. But if we want to claim that cooking really did shape our lineage, we have to walk into a very different landscape, the dig site. Because in science, sounds plausible doesn't count. You need evidence you can put on a table. So what does cooking look like when it's been buried for 1,000,000 years? Not a pot with property of Homo erectus carved into the side. Not a neat stone oven with a roasted antelope still inside. Most of what actually happened around ancient fires has rotted, washed away, or been pulverized into dust. What's left are tiny, stubborn traces, charred bones, discolored rocks, thin lenses of ash, chemical signatures locked into teeth, microscopic scratches on enamel, molecules of old fat and plant residue clinging to stone. Individually, each of these clues is weak, easy to misread, easy to lose. Together they start to look like fingerprints, and the closer archaeologists look, the more those fingerprints keep showing up, sometimes in places we never expected. Start with the most obvious suspect: burned bone. If ancient humans were roasting meat, you'd expect to find animal bones that have been heated, not by a volcano or a grass fire, but by someone putting flesh over coals. It turns out bone reacts differently depending on how it's burned. Throw a whole carcass into a wildfire and you tend to get chaotic scorching. Parts of the bone might be calcined, chalky white, super brittle, while other parts are untouched. The burning wraps around in uneven patterns driven by wind, brush, and the way the animal falls. Controlled fire is messier socially but tidier physically. Bones roasted near a hearth tend to show more patterned damage. One side darkened more than the other, as if it faced the heat. Ends cracked open in ways that suggest marrow extraction after heating. Fragment sizes are different too. Lots of smaller, repeating pieces where people broke long bones again and again to get at the good stuff. At some sites you see something else. Clusters of burned bone mixed with stone tools and sitting on top of old living surfaces, not randomly scattered through the sediment. That vertical stacking matters. It says, this is where someone was doing something again and again in the same spot. Still, bone alone doesn't clinch it. Lightning can start fires, grass can carry flame, carnivores can chew up carcasses and drag them onto old burn patches, so archaeologists go looking for the next part of the fire package: hearths. A hearth, in an archaeological sense, is any spot that shows concentrated evidence of repeated burning. Sometimes that's a blackened basin carved into the ground. Sometimes it's a simple flat patch of reddened soil. Sometimes it's a cluster of heat-altered stones that don't match the surrounding rock. Heat leaves a signature in minerals. Sand and clay baked at high temperatures change colour and structure. Rocks that sat in a fire crack, spool, or develop a kind of crazed pot-lid surface. When you map these features in 3 dimensions and find circular or oval patches of altered material, layered with ash and tiny charcoal fragments, you're probably looking at the footprint of a hearth. Now add behaviour. If those hearths are surrounded by stone tools, cut-marked bones and sleeping platforms, you're no longer just talking about fire that happened. You're talking about fire that was used and reused. And yet even here, the earth can lie. Winds can concentrate ash in low spots. Floods can move burned debris around. Later occupants can stomp through older layers and mix things up. So the best sites don't just have one indicator. They have a whole suite. Burned bone with cooking-like patterns, hearth-like features, heat-altered stone tools, and then, in the last few decades, an entirely new class of evidence has joined the circle around the fire: chemistry. Fire doesn't just blacken things, it reshuffles atoms. When people cook food on stone tools or in simple containers, trace residues can get pressed into microscopic cracks, protected from weathering by the very dirt that buries them. Millennia later, chemists can extract and analyze those ghostly leftovers. Animal fats leave distinctive lipid profiles. Plants leave bits of starch granules and phytoliths, tiny silica bodies that act like microscopic fossils. When those granules or phytoliths show physical damage consistent with heating, swollen, cracked or gelatinized structures, you're looking at direct evidence that someone or something cooked that plant. Even the isotopes, the ratios of different versions of the same element, can tell fire stories. When you heat bones for a long time at specific temperatures, their carbonate structure changes in predictable ways. The crystals inside grow, the organic fraction burns off, and the remaining mineral locks in altered isotope ratios. Under a microscope and a mass spectrometer, a bone burned in a campfire doesn't look quite like one cooked in a wildfire. The same goes for soil. Ash from wood and dung changes the chemistry of the ground. It can enrich certain elements like phosphorus and calcium in thin layers that match those reddened, heat-baked patches. When you drill tiny samples through a suspected hearth, and the chemistry spikes right where the colour changes, it's another tick mark on the cooking side of the ledger. But some of the most intimate evidence of cooking never touched the ground at all. It's still stuck on teeth. For a long time, fossil teeth were mostly used to estimate age and identify species. Then someone started looking at the crust, dental calculus, the hardened plaque that builds up at the gum line. That disgusting little ridge is an archaeological gold mine. Dental calculus traps everything: bits of plant tissue, fragments of muscle fibre, bacterial DNA, soot particles, starch grains. Once it mineralizes, it becomes a tiny concrete time capsule glued to your enamel. Under a powerful microscope, researchers have pulled out starch granules from wild grains that show the telltale swelling and cracking of partial cooking. They've found microcharcoal particles inhaled from smoky air, lodged between bacteria. They've even identified plant species that are nearly impossible to recognize from macroscopic remains, because the original leaves and roots have long since rotted away. So when a hominin tooth, 400,000 or 200,000 or 50,000 years old, shows a mix of cooked starch damage, meat fibres, and microcharcoal, it doesn't just say, "This individual ate plants and meat." It whispers, "This individual ate plants and meat in a smoky, fire-filled environment, with at least some of that plant food heated before chewing." Then comes microwear. Every food you chew leaves a different microscopic signature on enamel. Hard, brittle foods, like raw nuts or unpounded seeds, tend to leave pits and small impact scars. Tough, fibrous foods, like raw leaves and sinew, produce long scratches. Softer, processed or cooked foods can reduce overall wear or shift its patterns in subtle ways. No one can look at a tooth and declare, "This was a medium-rare antelope." But when microwear patterns shift across a population, fewer heavy impact pits, more fine scratches consistent with sliced meat or pre-crushed tubers, it supports the idea that food is being altered before it hits the molars. Still, if all of this sounds neat and clean, it isn't. One of the biggest misconceptions about this whole field is simple. Burned does not automatically mean cooked. A charred bone could be the result of a grass fire that swept through a predator's kill. A layer of ash could come from natural lightning strikes in a dry forest. Heat-altered rock might be the footprint of a long-dead lava flow, not a hearth. On the flip side, the absence of these traces at a given site doesn't prove that nobody there ever cooked. Most hearths were shallow scoops of earth and a few rocks. One bad rainstorm can erase their surface expression. trampling, burrowing animals and later occupations can smear ash into invisibility. In many ancient environments, the conditions needed to preserve fine-grained evidence, rapid burial, low oxygen, stable sediments, simply didn't happen. So when people argue online about the earliest controlled use of fire or when cooking really started, they're often imagining a smoking gun that archaeologists simply don't get. What we get instead are overlapping hints. At one African cave, you might find burned bone in clear hearth features, dated to 800,000 years ago. At another open-air site, you might find heat-altered stone tools alongside cut-marked carcasses, but almost no ash around the same time. In a later European cave, you might find thick hearth lenses with fire-reddened floors, dense charcoal layers, and teeth with cooked starch granules 300,000 years ago. In an Asian site, you might find soil chemistry consistent with repeated burning, but few tools, maybe a resting spot for embers carried from elsewhere. Any one of these data points can be attacked. Maybe the dating is off. Maybe the burning was natural. Maybe the residue is contamination. Scientists argue about this endlessly because that's their job. But when patterns start to line up across continents and time, burned bone, hearth structure, residue chemistry, dental calculus, micro-wear, all pointing toward the same behavior, the picture sharpens. It stops looking like a few isolated accidents with flame. It starts to look like a species that kept coming back to fire, that learned to sit beside it, work around it and feed from it. A species whose teeth, bones and soils all bear the same quiet message. By the time our brains were ready to be rewired, the world they were wiring themselves to fit was already flickering orange. And in that glow, something else was happening too, something we almost missed, until we noticed what was trapped in those toothcrust time capsules and what it implies about how people talked, remembered, and imagined together. Those little black specks in toothcrust, the reddened soil, the cracked bones, put together, they tell a powerful story about fire, but they don't tell a simple story, because as soon as you say, fire rewired our brains, you run headfirst into a line of people saying, hold on, what about everything else? They're not wrong. If you zoom out from the campfire glow and look at the whole 2 million year arc of our lineage, cooking is just one piece of a much bigger machine. Start with meat. Long before anyone was simmering stews or toasting grains, hominins were getting more and more of their calories from animal foods. Cut marks on fossils go back well over 2 million years. Some of those marks sit on top of tooth grooves from big cats and hyenas, which means our ancestors were butchering carcasses after predators were done with them. Scavengers, lurking at the edges. But not forever. By around 1.8 million years ago, with Homo erectus, the pattern shifts. You start seeing cut marks in places that suggest early access, tendon attachments, rich marrow-bearing bones snapped open with stone hammers. It looks less like grab what the lions leave and more like deliberate hunting. Meat is a caloric cheat code. Gram for gram, it's packed with energy, fat and key nutrients like iron and B vitamins. A hominin that can reliably get meat can support a bigger brain long before it ever learns to braise a shank. Some researchers argue that this shift to regular carnivory, more than fire, was the real inflection point that let brains grow and guts shrink. Then there are the tools themselves. Stone tools aren't just sharp rocks. The moment you start seeing standardized shapes, hand axes with near-perfect symmetry made by people separated by hundreds of miles, you're looking at something deeper. Planning, teaching, imitation. To make an Acheulean hand axe, you have to hold in your mind a three-dimensional form that does not yet exist, and then remove flakes in a careful sequence to reveal it. That's abstraction. That's the kind of mental rehearsal you also need for language, for social strategy, for remembering where the water is 3 valleys over. Tool use also changes what counts as food. With the right stones and sticks, you can dig up buried tubers, crack open nuts, strip bark, and butcher animals too large to drag. That flexibility, the ability to reach into new corners of the environment, feeds back into brain evolution. A creature that can solve more problems with objects needs neural wiring to match. Layer on top of that the brutal metronome in the background, climate. The Pleistocene wasn't a gentle age. It was a roller coaster of ice sheets, droughts, shifting coastlines, and disappearing forests. Environments that had been stable for hundreds of thousands of years could transform in a few human lifetimes. Some scientists argue that this climate chaos, more than any single technology, is what sculpted our brains. not because of one perfect adaptation, but because flexibility itself became the adaptation. If every generation has to figure out new migration routes, new prey, new plants, new seasons, then genes that favour curiosity, learning, and social information sharing get rewarded. In that view, brains didn't grow big for any one task, they grew big to never stop adapting. And then there's the most intimate engine of all, other people. Humans are born early and helpless. A baby chimp can cling to its mother and move with her in a way a human newborn never could. Our infants are effectively still fetal compared to other apes, their brains unfinished, their bodies undercooked. To make that work, you need help. Alloparenting, other people besides the biological mother investing in a child, changes everything. Grandmothers bringing food, older siblings watching the baby, unrelated group members sharing care because of social bonds, not just genes. Some anthropologists argue that this cooperative childcare system forced our ancestors to become expert mind readers. You have to track who owes what, who can be trusted with your offspring, whose reputation is good enough to be left alone with a crying baby at night. That's not just being nice. That's advanced social cognition under enormous stakes. Social brains like that can support gossip, teaching, punishment, praise. They can support culture. So by the time we get to the fireside, a lot of trends are already in motion. More meat, better tools, harsher, more variable climates, more intense social cooperation and shared child-rearing. Fire, in this view, isn't the spark that starts everything. It's the accelerant. This is where the cooking hypothesis sits. Not as a lone, heroic explanation, but as a powerful amplifier that plugs into an existing network. The core idea, as we've been circling around, is straightforward. Cooked food yields more usable energy, faster, with less wear and tear on teeth and guts. Over evolutionary time, that extra energy can be turned into more brain tissue, longer childhoods, more pregnancies, and a thicker web of social obligations around food. But there are real debates. Some archaeologists point out that the cleanest, least controversial hearths show up relatively late, hundreds of thousands of years after Homo erectus appears with its bigger brain and smaller gut. If cooking drove that anatomical shift, where's the smoking hearth? Others counter that we're victims of the fossil record. Early fire use would have happened in open landscapes, in shallow pits, with simple fuel. The perfect recipe for erasure. Caves preserve hearths, savannas wash them away. There's also the question of intensity. Maybe our ancestors used fire occasionally at first, opportunistically, like other animals are known to do, and only gradually moved toward daily cooking. A few roasted bones in one season, regular hearths much later. If that's true, then the metabolic impact of cooking might also have ramped up over long stretches, not in one dramatic leap. And then there are hybrid possibilities. Maybe brains started getting bigger primarily because of meat and climate-driven flexibility. Maybe guts started shrinking because a combination of softer foods, stone processing, and intermittent cooking lowered the need for industrial-strength intestines. Then, once habitual cooking locked in, it supercharged trends that were already underway. In that scenario, cooking is still transformative. It just doesn't stand alone. Think of it like this. You can have a small, clever social primate already making tools, hunting and weathering climate swings. Add fire, and suddenly all of those advantages scale. Cooking makes meat safer and easier to chew, so hunting pays off even more. Cooking softens underground storage organs, so tool-based digging becomes worth the effort in seasons when game is scarce. Cooking lets you safely share food in camp, so cooperative childcare and social exchange get a stable energy base to sit on. Cooking extends the day, so language, planning, and cultural teaching get their own protected time slot after dark. Nothing about fire invents these behaviors from scratch, it just turns them up. This is where humans start to look very different from the other animals huddling at the edge of wildfires. We don't just discover things, we stack them. Anthropologists call this cumulative culture. A chimpanzee can learn to crack nuts with a rock. Its offspring can copy that. But a million years later, chimp nut cracking looks basically the same. Humans are different. Once one generation learns to tame fire, the next generation doesn't just repeat the trick. It experiments. Different woods, different pit shapes, mixing embers with dung, using smoke to dry meat, baking clay, hardening spear points. Then those tweaks get remembered, taught, argued over, perfected. The same engine that lets a child learn language by osmosis also lets that child absorb 1,000 little fire hacks without ever rediscovering them. Culture becomes an environment of its own. Under that kind of feedback, a small innovation doesn't stay small, it snowballs. Cooking isn't just hot food, it's the foundation for schedules, for gendered labour divisions, for kinship obligations, for trade. We'll bring salt if you bring meat, for taboos about who gets the choicest cuts. Each one of those cultural rules can then shape who survives, who has children, whose ideas spread. So when we say one discovery rewired our brains, we have to be careful. No serious scientist thinks there was a single night in a single camp where someone struck a spark and everyone's skulls silently ballooned. What we can say is that control of fire, and especially the habit of cooking, looks like one of the few changes that echo everywhere at once, in our guts, our jaws, our sleep cycles, our child rearing, our social lives, our stories. It's pivotal without being lonely. The real takeaway is messier and in a way more impressive. We are the product of overlapping revolutions, meat-eating, tool-making, cooperative childcare, language, climate chaos, and the taming of fire all braided together over hundreds of thousands of years. No single strand can hold the weight of our evolution on its own, but twist them, pull them tight, and you get something strong enough to cross ice ages, which leads to an uncomfortable and very modern question. If fire was the ancient technology that quietly rewired our species, changed our bodies, our brains, our relationships, what's the equivalent now? We sit today in front of another glow, not from coals, but from screens. We've built tools that carry conversations across the planet instantly, that store more cultural information than any one brain could ever hold, that can serve up food, mates, entertainment, and status with a tap. Like fire, these systems are older than any individual using them. Like fire, they promise more convenience, more connection, more power. And like fire, they come with risks we don't fully understand yet. The last time our ancestors gathered around a new kind of light, it set off a chain reaction that ended with us. The question now is simple and terrifying. What exactly are we rewiring our minds for this time? So we end where we began. A small primate in the dark staring at something new. For almost 2 million years our ancestors tore at raw meat, with heavy jaws and long guts, burning more calories chewing than their brains could ever dream of using. They were tough, clever animals navigating a brutal world on foot and on instinct. Then, somewhere, somewhen, a line was crossed. Not the first time someone watched a wildfire. Not the first time a scavenged carcass came out a little singed. The line was when fire stopped being an accident and became a habit. When flames weren't just a thing that happened to the landscape, but a tool you could return to each night. Build, tend, protect. From there, everything we've talked about starts to braid together. Controlled fire meant cooking. Cooking meant more usable energy from the same food, in less time, with fewer pathogens. That extra energy could go into brains instead of bowels, into long childhoods instead of oversized molars, into a social life that didn't end when the sun went down. Safer food, shared heat, a predictable place to regroup. Suddenly the night wasn't just danger, it was a meeting. Around those early hearths you get the conditions for deeper cooperation. I'll watch your kid if you stir the pot. You get rules, who cooks, who carves, who eats first, who has to wait. You get stories, the hunt that went wrong, the ancestor who saw the sky fall, the lesson wrapped in a joke. A technology that started as a way to change calories quietly started changing relationships. And once relationships change, minds follow. More energy, yes, but also more practice reading faces in flickering light, more time rehearsing tomorrow out loud, more pressure to remember who helped you and who cheated you. That's not just biology, that's culture reaching back and tugging on anatomy. When you sit down today with a bowl of soup or a slice of toast or a microwaved leftover at midnight, you're inside that same loop. Every "what's for dinner" is an echo of ancient foraging decisions. Every family recipe is a tiny strand in that braided rope of cumulative culture. Even the simple act of gathering, around a table on a couch with takeout containers between you, is an inheritance from people who discovered that sharing heat and food was safer than facing the dark alone. So before you drift off tonight, you might try a quiet experiment. Think about your most ordinary food ritual, the coffee you make half asleep, the snack you reach for when you talk to a friend, the big meal you save for weekends. Ask yourself, which parts of this are modern convenience, and which parts are a 2 million-year-old survival system humming away under the surface? If listening to stories like this feels comforting, and you want to keep going down these prehistoric rabbit holes, there's more waiting for you. We put together a whole book of deep-time mysteries and ancient secrets, strange bottlenecks, lost cousins, quiet revolutions like fire that you can curl up with. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. If you'd like to help this kind of storytelling keep going, the easiest way is simple. Tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey back in time. And since we're now part of each other's nighttime ritual, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now where you are? Because somewhere, in every time zone, people are still doing the same ancient thing, gathering around a little patch of light in the dark, sharing warmth, sharing food, sharing stories, carrying forward the spark that lit the human story in the first place.